Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Keep up with all of this at Tarpley.net. Tarpley.net. You'll get my program on derivatives in about 5 minutes off of a film clip from Russia Today. We're getting the second wave of the Depression, and uncannily enough, ironically enough, uncannily enough, it's coming more or less the way it did between 1929 and 1931, 2-year gap, from 2008 to 2010, and it's the springtime. It's the second spring after the big panic in the U.S. that you then get the European side of it breaking down, long-term structural features of the world financial system perhaps coming into play. So, as Hoover says, in April everybody thought there was a recovery, and then in early May we get the Kreditanstalt Vienna blowing up, the Hungarian banking system blowing up. On May 20th, 1931, Herbert Hoover calls in the Federal Reserve Board to discuss the threat, because he can see it. And they tell him that you're seeing ghosts, that there's no danger to the United States, and there's nothing that they couldn't handle. The Federal Reserve always striking out, always failing because of their built-in institutional tendencies. So then Hoover gets a letter from President von Hindenburg of Germany saying, please do something to save us, right? We're Germany. We've suffered a great deal. We're about to collapse, and please do something. So by this point, and this can come very quickly, you can go back and look at the chronology in those days, by the time you get to June of 1931, all the banks in Germany have shut down. All the banks in Austria have shut down. All the banks in Hungary have shut down. And everything further east, in other words, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, all banking panic, all shut down. Very little known in the U.S. We're talking May and June of 1931. So at this point, now this is, if you think my discussion of a debt moratorium for Greece is somehow radical communist, well, watch what Herbert Hoover, Republican, in many ways Mr. Free Market, then does. And it's a credit to him that he was able to do this. He's got Stimson and Mellon over in Europe, Mellon in particular running around. Even Mellon comes on board for the idea of providing debt relief for Central Europe. What we come up with then is, with Hoover, June 20th, 1931, Hoover proposes, essentially declares, a debt moratorium, a debt freeze. And this is a very good thing at this point. And it's essentially saying that the United States government proposes that there should be a cessation of payments. I'll just read it. The American government proposes the postponement for 1 year of all payments on intergovernmental debt, reparations, relief debts, principal and interest, not including obligations of governments held by private parties, subject to the confirmation of Congress. So it's a debt freeze for 1 year on all intergovernmental financial debt, the main forms being the reparations owed by Germany or extorted from Germany under the Versailles Treaty to Britain and France, and then the war debts owed by Britain, France, and so forth to the United States. So Herbert Hoover, reactionary Republican, or at least, right-wing Republican, whatever you're going to call him, has the foresight, the breadth of initiative to say, we've got to do something. We've got to stop this entire thing from collapsing. So it's time now to think in those terms. The fatal flaw, of course, of what Hoover did is it should not have been for 1 year. It should have been 5 years or the duration of the world economic depression. It can't be limited in that way. And then he got into these things, the standstill agreements. In other words, what's going to happen to Greek debt? We had standstill agreements come forward in in the last crisis in 1998, 1999, when we had Russia and long-term capital management blowing up, long-term capital management blowing up from derivatives. People said, let's have standstill agreements. Let's just agree to let the debt sit there, and we won't call for payment, and we'll pretend that everything's okay. That's no good. That essentially paralyzes economic activity. You don't get a recovery. That's what you don't want to do. It's time to declare debt moratorium. So by July 15th, 1931, Austria, Germany, Hungary, and everything further east had closed down. And that's because the French stalled on Herbert Hoover's debt moratorium. So no standstills, no IMF, no bailout. You don't need a bailout. What you need to do is to freeze that debt instead of throwing money down the rat hole of derivatives so David Einhorn and Soros can gobble it up. Freeze that stuff. Let them take a bath. Let them take a haircut. And then use that money to start building something. Start building maglabs and hospitals and telecommunications and other things in Greece. And get a perspective for the future of the Greek economy. They're going to need high technology, high value-added exports. What could those be? Olives and wine and tourism are great. Got to have those. But you've got to have something that puts you at the leading edge of the modern world. And it is it's the cradle of civilization, right? If you're devoted to Plato, as I am, then you've got to think about doing something for Greece. And remember, those rating agencies are absolute sewers of corruption. Standard & Poor's, Fitch, Moody's, time to fire them, time to put them out of business before they strike our country too, because they're preparing to strike the United States. And you're going to get a gang of thugs and criminals and corrupt characters who are going to turn around and say that the United States government's not creditworthy. Well, you rating agencies are not credible in any way. So this is now the situation. Now let's think about Goldman Sachs, of course. My question for Goldman Sachs is, I don't want to investigate why this charge was brought now. I want to know how come it took so long. How come it took a year and a half to have some kind of an investigation, some kind of charges against Goldman Sachs? You may remember that the head of the Securities and Exchange Commission during the crisis of September, October 2008 was an absolutely feckless, useless clown. Congressman Cox, former Congressman Cox, Chris Cox of New Jersey, I think, had become the head of the SEC. And as all kinds of books about to make clear, he was worse than useless because he believed in this free market myth. Nobody else around him did, of course. They were interested in bailouts, so he just basically sat there and did nothing. They were calling on him to do things like stop selling of financial institutions, stop the naked shorts. You had people like Peter Schiff of Euro Pacific Capital was part of the hedge fund attack on Lehman Brothers. He was quoted as talking about how bad Lehman Brothers was. So he was piling on to drive Lehman Brothers into bankruptcy. Well, that's predatory behavior. There's nothing public-spirited about that. I'm sure there are a lot of people in Connecticut who lost their jobs as a result of the bankruptcy of Goldman Sachs that will be interested to know how Peter Schiff was part of that hedge fund attack, going along with David Einhorn of Greenlight Capital and SAC Financial Partners and Paulson and Company and all the rest of them that were shorting Lehman. Peter Schiff, part of that. So you want a hedge fund hyena for your senator? That's really pathetic. So that's Cox. Anyway, the SEC is now under Shapiro. God knows she's bad enough, but she's trying to show that she's not Cox. So this is the situation. There's another case emerging on Goldman Sachs, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. Back in a second here on World Crisis Radio.